Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Moonlit Fears. Tonight, we dive into the dark and dangerous world of ocean terror with 10 of the most disturbing true cruise ship horror stories. These frightening tales come from real passengers, crew, members, and professionals at sea, people who went through terrifying events aboard massive ships that changed the way they see ocean travel forever. Each story is a real nightmare that happened far out in international waters, where help is miles away and normal rules of safety simply don't exist. From stalkers roaming dim hallways to crew members uncovering deadly secrets hidden deep within the ship, tonight's stories reveal the chilling truth behind the glamorous cruise industry. These aren't myths or campfire tales, but real accounts from people who faced pure terror while trapped at sea. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to Moonlit Fears for true horror stories that shine light on the shadows most would rather ignore. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the horrors hidden beneath the surface. Now let's begin this journey into the abyss, where luxury turns to nightmare and the ocean guards its darkest secrets. Like many people in their 20s, I believed that celebrating my college graduation with a cruise would be ideal. I had been saving for this Caribbean trip for months because I love traveling alone. They are essentially floating cities with thousands of strangers, as any cruiser who has taken one knows. And that was in 2019. Cruise lines did not promote security as much as they do now. There were also extremely unsettling incidents on those ships, including crew members ignoring passenger complaints, attacks going unreported, and people going missing. Furthermore, corporate practices that prioritized profits over people completely ignored it. Madison is my name, and I believed I was unbeatable at 22. Summa cum laude, I had recently received my journalism degree from Northwestern, and I treated myself to this 7-day Western Caribbean cruise before beginning the arduous task of entry-level reporting positions. At the time, it seemed like a wise, economical move for me to get a solo inner cabin on the Carnival Vista. I had no idea that decision would almost result in my death. If the ship's layout hadn't been so disorienting, if cruise security hadn't been so slack, and if I hadn't been so unaware of the predators that prey on lone female passengers on these floating cities, the events of those 7 days at sea would never have escalated to the point where they did. However, cruise lines profit greatly from giving the appearance of safety, while routinely neglecting to safeguard their most vulnerable customers. It was a beautiful first day. I snapped pictures of the boundless ocean, explored every deck, and experienced the exhilarating freedom that comes from being totally cut off from everyday life. There were Cozumel. I watched the welcoming show, ate at the buffet, and then went to bed. I initially became aware of him at that point. I was sipping coffee at the cafe on Deck 5 when he introduced himself. His name was Kyle, with thinning brown hair, pale blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him, and an average height. He was most likely in his mid-30s. He was dressed in khaki shorts and a faded Hawaiian shirt. The stereotypical middle-aged cruiser who makes an excessive effort to appear at ease. Kyle initially appeared to be innocuous enough. He informed me that he was traveling alone as well, and that he was attempting to rediscover himself on the broad seas after being divorced recently. We discussed the forthcoming port calls and the different ship facilities for perhaps 15 minutes. Kyle mentioned that this was his 4th time on the ship, giving the impression that he was well-versed in cruise travel. He was aware of the greatest locations for pictures. The eateries with the lowest wait Thai travelers would wind up in the same public spaces. We docked in Jamaica on the 3rd day, and I made reservations for a shore excursion to Dunn's River Falls. I saw Kyle observing from the pier as our group made our way back to the ship. He had come to the port expressly to wait for returning passengers because he was not a member of our tour group. He joyfully waved and jogged over to inquire about my day once our eyes locked. Even though he never inquired about my plans for the shore excursion, the fact that he knew exactly when I would be returning chilled me to the bone. In order to keep Kyle from finding me in the main dining rooms that evening, I made the decision to eat supper at one of the specialty restaurants. I explicitly asked for a table in the back corner where I could see anyone entering when I made my appointment at the steakhouse on Deck 8. The supper was excellent, and I felt like I could unwind and enjoy my vacation for the first time in 2 days. However, Kyle showed up at my table just as I was finishing my dessert. The hostess had seated him despite the fact that he was not dressed for the fancy restaurant. He was still wearing his Hawaiian shirt and shorts. The fact that we had both selected the same restaurant on the same night, he said, was an incredible coincidence. He wanted to have a drink with me. And his face briefly clouded before reverting to that artificial smile when I graciously rejected, explaining that I was exhausted and going back to my cabin. As the gentlemanly thing to do, Kyle insisted on showing me the way back to my room. My entire body begged me to say no, but I was brought up to be kind, and I was apprehensive about the consequences of publicly turning down his advances. I therefore allowed him to lead me through the ship's meandering passageways, down a number of staircases, and through the interior cabin part, on deck 2, which is like a maze. Kyle casually discussed the ship's layout with me while we were walking, pointing out that it would be simple to get lost in the interior hallways, particularly late at night when most passengers were asleep or in the public areas. Himikosi, it might make me feel isolated from everything because it was at the end of a dead-end hallway. I discovered that Kyle had been researching the ship's layout in relation to my accommodations when he provided such detailed information about the location of my room. This wasn't just a kind fellow traveler making a casual remark. This was reconnaissance from a person with quite clear and unsettling goals. Kyle stayed in the small corridor until we got to my cabin door, not moving, to go to his own room. He inquired about my plans for the next day, including whether I would be going ashore in Grand Cayman or remaining aboard the ship. He asked me specific questions about the activities that piqued my attention and my typical bedtime after I provided evasive responses. Despite the ship's air conditioning, I could feel the perspiration on my forehead as his inquiries felt like an interrogation. At last, I was able to excuse myself and enter my cabin, quickly fastening the security chain and deadbolt. Ice. The typical settling and creaking sounds of the ship sounded like footsteps coming towards my door. I heard what sounded like someone attempting to put something under my door at around 200 a.m. But nothing was there when I plucked up the guts to look. I was awake the remainder of the night, holding my phone, prepared to contact ship security if Kyle attempted to act in a more hostile manner. I immediately went to the guest services desk the following morning to report Kyle's actions. Although she listened courteously, the young woman behind the desk didn't appear to care about my worries at all. She informed me that kind gestures are frequently misinterpreted by lone travelers, and that Kyle was most likely simply being kind since he was also lonely. She responded that the ship was fully booked, and there were no more rooms available when I emphasized that his actions felt predatory and asked if I might be moved to a different cabin. The guest services agent did consent to record my complaint in Kyle's passenger file. However, she made it apparent that security could not intervene unless he truly did something physically dangerous. She advised me to spend the rest of the voyage in the crowded public places and try to stay away from him. I realized that I was entirely on my own when she treated my very serious anxieties with such contempt. I made an effort to heed her instructions over the next 2 days. Throughout the day, I remained in the busiest areas of the ship, where I was constantly encircled by other travelers. I never went any place by myself after dark and stayed away from the calmer decks. However, regardless of where I went or how, while I attempted to blend in with other travelers, Kyle appeared to have an uncanny capacity to discover me. The ship was throwing a large farewell party on the Leo deck on our last night at sea, with hundreds of other travelers and numerous pubs and food kiosks generating steady foot flow. I reasoned that this would be the safest spot to spend the evening. I dressed as modestly as I could and positioned myself as close to the center of the gathering as I could from any exits or remote spots. I saw Kyle observing me from the other side of the deck as the celebration was in full throttle. He was standing by himself at the railing, staring at me, not taking part in the celebrations. I could still feel his gaze like a physical burden despite the commotion, music, laughter, and overall mayhem of a shipboard party. He followed me when I walked to a new section of the deck, constantly keeping the same straight line of sight. I made the decision that I could not handle it any longer at about 11 p.m. I was worn out from being on guard all day, plus the strain of I was getting physically ill from hunting. I intended to return to my cabin, gather my things, and use the last few hours before disembarking to spend time in the 24-hour cafe, where people would always be present. I took a diversion through the busiest area in order to get to the lift, bank, sections of the vessel. However, I noticed that the throngs were dispersing as I passed by the Deck 5 atrium, as travelers either made their way to their rooms or made themselves at home in the late-night venues. The sophisticated 3-story building that had appeared so opulent and inviting on my initial visit now felt ominous and menacing. I waited while the floor numbers gradually decreased after pressing the lift button. I heard footsteps coming across the marble floor behind me. But when I turned around, the atrium seemed deserted, save for a few staff workers tidying up after the evening's events. I had the unsettling impression that someone was observing me from one of the upper balconies that overlooked the area, even though the footsteps had ceased. When the lift eventually arrived, I entered and pressed the Deck 2 button. A hand sprang out to halt the doors as they started to close. Kyle joined me in pushing into the lift. His face was plastered with the same false smile. However, there was a change in his gaze this time, something ruthless and predatory that chilled my blood. Despite the fact that he had not witnessed me pressing any buttons, he said, "Going down to your room, Madison?" Before realized that he had somehow orchestrated this entire meeting as the lift started to descend towards Deck 2. Kyle remarked, "You have been avoiding me," with a wounded, even whiny tone in his voice. I believed that we were going to be buddies. Real time together, just the two of us, is something I've been eager to do. I shuddered when he stated real time. I reiterated to him that I didn't want to spend time with him, that I felt uncomfortable with his actions, and that I just wanted him to go away. However, Kyle simply laughed, which was a totally unfunny sound. He said, "Come on, Madison," and took a step forward. "Avoid acting in that manner. On this large ship, you and I are alone. We ought to look out for one another." When the lift arrived at Deck 2, the doors opened to let me see the small, poorly lighted hallway leading to my cabin. Kyle motioned for me to leave first, but I resisted. I could see that the hallway was deserted, and I was aware that I would be stranded, with him in one of the ship's most remote areas as the lift doors closed behind us. At that point, Kyle tried to yank me from the lift by grabbing my wrist. He had an extremely firm grasp, and his fingers pressed far enough into my skin to cause bruises. He was far stronger than his average frame had indicated, even though I yelled and attempted to pull away. He hissed that I was being dramatic and that I should stop, and he pulled me towards the lift doors that were opening. The lift doors started to close once again as he was ready to drag me into the hallway. Kyle had to decide between holding onto me and stopping the doors after someone on a different floor called for it. I jerked loose and pressed against the lift car's rear wall during that little moment of indecision. Kyle's face went utterly blank. Something icy and cunning was shown beneath the facade of "I'm Trevor Jameson, and I've worked on cruise ships for more than 10 years. Nothing could have prepared me for what I saw while working the night shift on Deck 7 of the Royal Caribbean, Anthem of the Seas, but I have seen things that would chill your blood. The majority of passengers never see the crew quarters of these enormous ships, and they have no idea what goes on in the service rooms and hallways when everyone else is asleep. The cruise business would abruptly collapse if they did. When I was 24, just out of a disastrous marriage and searching for a fresh start, I began working on cruise ships. It was a good wage, the world must be seen. The nicest part was that you could spend months at a time escaping your troubles. When you sign that contract, no one informs you that occasionally people vanish forever. Additionally, the business follows very precise protocols to ensure that those disappearances are never included in official reports. I had access to every area of the ship save the bridge, and the captain's quarters throughout my 8 years as a night shift maintenance crew member. Between midnight and 6 a.m., when the day shift took over, it was my responsibility to fix everything that broke. Faulty lifts, leaking pipes, broken air conditioners, and electrical issues that couldn't wait till morning. Although most nights were routine, there is always something that has to be fixed because cruise ships are intricate machines with thousands of moving parts. A cruise ship's crew quarters are completely different from the passenger decks. Where we work, there are only little hallways with exposed pipes instead of marble flooring or crystal chandeliers. The continuous flickering of fluorescent lighting, and the hum of the equipment that powers the entire activity. Diesel gasoline combined with industrial cleaning is the smell of the air. Additionally, the enormous engines that propel us across the ocean at 20 knots cause the walls to V travelers who had reserved internal rooms in the ship's most remote areas. Because they lack windows and are situated in the middle of the ship, distant from the main decks and facilities, interior staterooms are the least expensive choice. They are ideal for those who are only interested in a place to sleep and don't care about balcony access or views of the ocean. Additionally, they are ideal for those who wish to vanish from view without anyone noticing. During a 7-night Eastern Caribbean trip in October 2018, I saw firsthand what truly happened to these early departures. Around 3 in the morning, when I was making my routine rounds, I heard voices coming from one of the service hallways on Deck 3, next to the medical bay. Only crew personnel with the appropriate key cards were intended to be able to enter this area, which was supposed to be off limits to passengers. Passengers occasionally got lost attempting to find their rooms, especially after a night of heavy drinking, so I approached discreetly. However, as I approached, I understood that the sounds were through organization for over 15 years, was someone I knew. Although his clothing suggested he was a member of the guest services team, the other voice belonged to a person I had never met. They were talking about a 62-year-old widow from Ohio called Patricia Coleman, was a passenger who had reserved a solo trip to commemorate her retirement. Patricia had been asking too many questions concerning a former traveler who had allegedly disembarked early in Jamaica, based on the conversation I overheard. After the cruise finished, Patricia began asking the crew questions because she had been friends with this traveler and could not get in touch with her via phone. 3 times, she has visited guest services to inquire about her companion. The guest services representative claimed to be aware that the woman in Jamaica never left the ship. When we returned to Port Everglades, she is threatening to report us missing. I was completely chilled by Marcus Webb's response. No reports will be filed by Patricia Coleman. He predicted that she will have a terrible mishap tonight. Deck 12 near the railing experienced a slip and fall. Most likely became confused in the dark after drinking too much at the casino. I barely dared organizing standard upkeep rather than the killing of a defenseless woman. The guest services representative explained that Patricia's bags would be disposed of in the same manner as they have in the past, and that her cabin would need to be emptied out before the ship returned to port. He added that there would be fewer issues with Patricia's inheritance because she had used a credit card to pay for the cruise and had not bought travel insurance. They concluded their brainstorming session and parted ways after roughly 10 minutes. My heart was racing so loudly that I was worried they may hear it bouncing off the metal walls as I waited in the hallway for an additional 30 minutes. I returned to my designated work area after I was certain they were gone and attempted to comprehend what I had just heard. I felt I needed to tell someone what I had heard, but who could I put my trust in? How many other security guards participated in the scheme if Marcus Webb was one of the murderers? How far up the corporate ladder did this go if guest services was aiding in the con? Every shadow in the hallway appeared menacing. I jumped at every sound. I couldn't stop thinking about Patricia Coleman, who was most likely sleeping in her cabin, and oblivious to the fact that her retirement celebration was turning into her funeral. As my shift was coming to a conclusion at 5 in the morning, I heard the ship's emergency alarm system go off. Passengers were advised to stay in their cabins while the problem was being handled after an incident on Deck 12 was announced over the intercom. I was aware of what had happened right away, but I was helpless to stop it. Patricia Coleman fell overboard while wandering alone on the upper deck between 4 and 5 a.m., according to the official report. There was no video of the incident since the security cameras in that area had broken. The Coast Guard conducted a thorough search, but her corpse was never found. Her family was told that she had probably lost her way in the dark after drinking too much at the casino. However, I was aware of the reality. Patricia Coleman was still alive and well. She had been killed by crew members who were involved in a planned effort to get rid of passengers who were interfering too much or threatening the ship's operations. She did not commit suicide or have an accident. It was a well-planned operation intended to safeguard business interests and preserve the appearance of security that encourages cruise reservations. I saw or heard about at least 6 additional incidents involving lone travelers who had somehow turned into an issue for the cruise line during the course of the following 2 years. After complaining of food poisoning, an elderly man tumbled down a set of steps. In her cabin, a middle-aged woman who had reported being sexually assaulted by a crew member suffered a heart attack. After his cabin was cleaned up and his booking, records were changed to indicate he had never been aboard the cruise. A young college student who claimed to have seen drug trafficking among the entertainment personnel vanished completely. Every occurrence was meticulously planned and carried out to appear to be an unfortunate accident or natural death. It looked like the security camera systems would always break down at the most inconvenient times. According to the medical examiner's reports, there was never any evidence of foul play. Small compensation payments were made to the victims' relatives in order to prevent wrongful death claims, and the cases were soon forgotten. These cruise ships weren't floating resorts, I realized. Corporate leaders might execute anyone who endangered their profits in these floating prisons, because there were no legitimate authorities to look into suspicious fatalities because of the remote location in international waters. The travelers weren't clients who needed to be safeguarded. They were possible dangers that might be controlled or removed as necessary. My last contract in early 2020 was the tipping point. I was tasked with cleaning out a passenger's cabin after they purportedly disembarked early in Cozumel. However, I discovered a leather journal in the closet that had been missed by the person who had cleaned the space. Robert Shaw, a retired investigator, kept the journal, and his last writings detailed his investigation into his daughter's abduction on a prior vacation. His notes state that Robert Shaw had intentionally scheduled this cruise to look into the disappearance of his 25-year-old daughter, Jessica, who had gone missing 6 months prior while on a Caribbean cruise. He had been doing methodical crew interviews and recording discrepancies in the official accounts. He claimed to have found evidence of an organized murder ring functioning within the cruise industry in his final entry, which was made just 2 days prior to his own early departure. Names, dates, and thorough details of at least 12 strange fatalities that Robert Shaw had linked to various cruise companies were included in that journal. He had been assembling evidence that would have exposed the entire scheme and resulted in the murder convictions of scores of people. However, the assassins had somehow learnt about his inquiry and killed him before he could provide the authorities his proof. I captured images of each page in that journal and saved them to a safe cloud storage location. At the very next port, I resigned and disembarked from the ship. Since then, I have never worked on a cruise ship, and for the past 5 years, I have lived in continual worry that they will discover me and silence me in the same manner that they silenced Patricia Coleman, Robert Shaw, and everyone else. The cruise industry sells the illusion of glamorous, safe maritime travel, bringing in billions of dollars annually. However, the truth is that these ships are lawless places where business interests take precedence over human life, and anyone who challenges the appearance of safety might vanish into thin air. Keep in mind that you are purchasing more trialize when you enter this new world. Booking an inside stateroom on a 14-day transatlantic trip was arguably the worst choice I have ever made, because I have always been claustrophobic. However, the internal accommodations were nearly half as expensive as the cabins with an ocean view, and my wife, Jessica, urged that we save money for our honeymoon. 3 years later, what appeared to be wise budgeting became a nightmare that still plagues me. I'm Marcus Thompson, and I'm 28 years old. This voyage from New York to Southampton was meant to be the romantic beginning of Jessica and my wedded life together. We had been together since college, from the formal evening attire to the Azore beach excursions. We had meticulously planned every aspect for months. Finding out that our floating honeymoon suite was constructed on top of a crime site that the cruise line had concealed for decades was something we had not anticipated. If the lock on the cabin door hadn't broken on our 5th night at sea during the storm, if our emergency call hadn't been answered by the maintenance team after 3 hours, we would never have known what was behind the walls of cabin 2147 if we hadn't been confined in that cramped metal cage while the ship tossed violently through 20-foot swells. Cruise ship interior rooms are essentially windowless cages built to accommodate as many passengers as possible while keeping construction expenses to a minimum. With 2 narrow beds that could be pushed together, a small bathroom and barely enough floor space to open one suitcase at a time. Our room was perhaps 80 square feet in total. Cheap wood paneling was used to cover the walls, giving the impression that they were warm and opulent. However, industrial metal and insulation were all that was visible behind that exterior. Launched in 2010, the Celebrity Eclipse was one of the fleet's newest ships, equipped with all the newest amenities and safety measures. However, the incessant shaking from the engines made it impossible to forget that you were confined in a metal container hundreds of miles from land, and our cabin was on deck 2, deep below the ship's guts. The hallway outside, even persons of normal height felt as though they were walking through a submarine in our small, poorly lit room with a low ceiling. Everything went flawlessly for the first 4 days of our cruise. We dined at every restaurant, toured every deck, and spent observing dolphins swimming alongside the ship for hours on the observation deck. Jessica was beaming with joy, snapping pictures all the time, and gushing about how this was the best choice we had ever made. Since we mostly spent our time in the public spaces and just went back to our room to sleep and change, the claustrophobia I had in our cabin was tolerable. However, the captain had not prepared for the enormous storm system we came across on the 5th night. Moderate seas and light rain were predicted in the weather reports. However, we encountered a full-scale North Atlantic gale with waves that rose above the upper decks and persistent gusts of 60 mph. The ship was built to withstand inclement weather. However, we were not prepared for the storm's severity in any way. We made the decision to head back to our cabin early at around 1000 p.m. because Jessica was experiencing seasickness due to the ship's motion. Since most travelers had either gone to their rooms or were battling motion sickness of their own, the public spaces were all but deserted. Due to the car's extreme swaying and the wires groaning from the strain of the ship's motion, the lift journey down to deck 2 was horrifying. I inserted the key card when we arrived at our cabin and heard the recognizable beep that meant the lock had disengaged. However, nothing happened when I attempted to turn the handle. The mechanical parts appeared to be jammed, but the electrical lock had come loose. I made several more attempts, pushing and tugging on the door as Jessica steadied herself against the ship's rolling motion by holding onto the wall. After battling with the door for 10 or so minutes, Jessica recommended that we contact maintenance. We spoke with a busy-sounding crew member over the customer support number, who informed us that they were unable to provide an estimated time for repair because they were juggling several emergency problems throughout the ship. He recommended that we wait in one of the lounges while they took care of non-essential maintenance until the storm had passed. However, Jessica's condition was getting worse every minute, and it was intolerable to consider spending the night in a busy public place while suffering from severe seasickness. I informed the maintenance dispatcher that my wife was sick and that she needed quick access to our lavatory. He put me on hold for a few minutes and then came back to tell that someone will be dispatched to our area, but that because of the storm, it might take several hours. All we could do was sit on the industrial carpet in that cramped passageway and wait as the ship rolled and pitched around us. We could hear the ship's structure moaning as it struggled against the paneling surrounding the door frame had begun to come away from the wall, most likely as a result of the ship's motion during the storm. At first, the distance was barely noticeable, perhaps half an inch, but it widened as the ship flexed and twisted in the rough seas. My blood ran cold when I saw the metal structure of the ship's hull visible through the ornamental paneling. The metal had black stains that strangely resembled dried blood, and what appeared to be frantic inscriptions etched by someone's fingernails were scratched into the steel. To get a closer look at what was behind the wall, I took out my phone and activated the torch feature. The scratches created rudimentary letters that said, "Help me," and they murdered Sarah and our precise cabin number, 2147. More dark stains and what appeared to be shreds of cloth that had been pushed into the spaces between the metal plates were visible beneath these messages. I began snapping pictures of whatever I could see behind the divided paneling, but Jessica was too ill to notice what I was learning. More holes in the wall covers, which showed more proof of violence that had taken place here, were discovered as the storm continued to lash the ship. It appeared as though someone had scratched the walls in desperation. Additionally, I noticed what looked to be a human tooth embedded in a dark, sticky substance in one corner. The maintenance team finally showed up to work on our door around 2:00 a.m. The middle-aged Filipino technician was anxious and kept his eyes on the damaged wall paneling. His face completely transformed when I questioned him about the stains and words hidden behind the walls. In halting English, he advised me not to look at those things because they were outdated issues that had already been resolved. I continued, taking pictures of the evidence behind the walls while the door lock was being repaired, which took an additional hour. As he watched me record our findings, the maintenance guy grew more and more upset. He insisted repeatedly that the stains were caused by ancient water damage and that the scratched inscriptions were simply graffiti from unruly passengers, but his justifications failed to take into consideration the blatant indications of violence and despair etched into the ship's metal framework. I started looking more closely at the walls as soon as we arrived at our cabin at around 3 in the morning. I was able to remove several loose wood paneling parts away from the underlying structure to uncover additional unsettling evidence. Someone had scrawled a thorough note under our bed's headboard, detailing the 2015 Caribbean cruise murder of Sarah Martinez, who was killed in this stateroom. The note stated that Sarah Martinez, a 26-year-old Phoenix teacher, had taken a solo vacation to commemorate her recent promotion. She was placed in cabin 2147, which was also where Jessica and I were meant to spend our honeymoon. Sarah learnt that her cabin steward was robbing passengers and selling their possessions to crew members who snuck them off the ship at different ports on the 4th night of her voyage. The steward became frightened and attacked Sarah when she questioned him about the theft, preventing her from reporting him to security. She had struggled for her life, attempting to cry for aid and clawing at the walls as he strangled her with a bathroom towel, according to the message. In the middle of the night, her body was dismembered in the small bathroom of the cabin, and the fragments were then dumped via one of the ship's waste systems. The most horrible fact was that Sarah had been trapped and hurt in the cabin for about an hour after the initial attack, while her assailant carefully considered how to dispose of her body. In the hopes that someone would eventually learn the truth about what had happened to her, she had scratched her story into the metal walls with her fingernails and a shattered fragment of the bathroom mirror. Her note ended with a request that whoever discovered it get in touch with her family in Phoenix and clarify that she had not committed suicide or unintentionally gone travelers. By merely covering the evidence with new wall panels, the cruise line concealed Sarah Martinez's murder and proceeded to rent the room to unwary passengers. The following morning, when Jessica was feeling better, I showed her what I had found. She was appalled not just by the proof of Sarah's death, but also by the knowledge that only 3 years prior, we had been sleeping in a place where someone had been tortured and killed. Knowing that the cruise company knew what had occurred in that stateroom, but had decided to conceal it rather than conduct a thorough investigation into the crime or pay respect to the victim's memory, made us both feel ill. During the final 9 days of our voyage, we documented all we discovered and conducted internet research on Sarah Martinez. We learned that she had actually been reported missing in 2015 while on a Caribbean vacation, but the official inquiry had determined that she had unintentionally fallen overboard after drinking too much. Sarah was a skilled swimmer WU found in spite of a thorough Coast Guard search. Although the private investigator her family had engaged discovered many discrepancies in the official report, they were unable to establish foul play. After we got back to New York, I got in touch with We presented all of the evidence we had found in cabin 2147 to the Sarah Martinez family in Phoenix. After 3 years of wondering what had truly happened, her parents were both glad to receive answers and devastated to hear the truth of their daughter's death. We assisted them in bringing a wrongful death claim against the cruise line and sent them copies of every photo. After 2 years of litigation, a private settlement was reached, which required the cruise company to properly investigate suspicious passenger fatalities and to honor victims rather than hide criminal evidence. A portion of the settlement funds were utilized by Sarah's family to create a charity that offers assistance to the relatives of passengers who go missing or pass away in questionable circumstances while aboard cruise ships. However, the fact that Sarah Martinez's story was eventually told was the most significant result. Her family now understands that she died defending the truth about the brutality and corruption that the cruise industry tries so hard to conceal, and that her frantic messages scratched into the cabin's walls were not in vain. Even if what we found in cabin 2147, may have destroyed our honeymoon, we nevertheless received something more priceless than sentimental recollections. We helped make sure her death wasn't entirely pointless by speaking up for someone who had been silenced. Since then, the cruise operator has refurbished stateroom 2147 once more, most likely erasing any traces of Sarah's murder. However, the reality of what transpired in that room cannot be totally dispelled, because there are now those who are aware of her tale and will ensure that it is never forgotten. When booking an inside cabin on a cruise ship, keep in mind that you can be sleeping in a room where a violent death occurred, and that the lovely wall decorations may conceal evidence of crimes that will never be thoroughly investigated. I believed the kids' club would be a boon to me as a single mother. During our 7-day Mediterranean trip, my 8-year-old daughter Lily could make friends while I finally had some adult time. The counselor's eager smiles and matching polo shirts gave off an air of friendliness and professionalism. Predators had transformed the ship's kids' activities into their own hunting grounds, and I was unaware that I was giving my child up to them. I'm 35 years old, and my name is Angela Rodriguez. I had been working double shifts as a nurse to make ends meet after my divorce 2 years prior, and this trip was meant to be our new beginning together. I believed that Lily would recover from the pain of witnessing her parents' marriage disintegrate with a week of adventure and sunshine, as she had endured a lot throughout the divorce process. I didn't realize that I was about to subject her to something much worse than anything she had ever encountered. If I hadn't followed my maternal intuition on the third night when Lily began experiencing nightmares, if I hadn't noticed how her behavior changed subtly and how she recoiled when specific crew members got close, if I hadn't followed her one night during movie night when she said she needed to use the loo, I never would have discovered the true nature of those special activity periods in the youth center on board the ship. With award-winning kid-friendly programming for children ages 3 to 17, the Norwegian Dawn was promoted as a family-friendly ship. With distinct spaces for various age groups, video game consoles, craft stations, and even a tiny theater where they screened age-appropriate films, the youth center occupied the majority of Deck 12. The program director, Michael Stevens, a gregarious man in his 40s who seemed to truly enjoy dealing with children, oversaw the 6 counselors on staff. I escorted Lily to the kids' club on our first day on board so she could register and become acquainted with the amenities. With cartoon characters painted on the walls and every safety device you could think of, the room was airy and vibrant. The counselors were vivacious and kind, playing a game with Lily and a few other just-arrived kids right away. I was given a comprehensive tour of the facilities by Michael Stevens, who also described the organized daily routine of meals, activities, and monitored leisure time. I was most pleased by how well organized and polished everything appeared to be. The counselors were certified in child development and had undergone background checks. Every day, parents received thorough updates on the behavior and activities of their kids. Children could only be picked up by their registered guardians who were properly identified, and the youth center was equipped with security cameras. Lily seemed to be able to spend time in the safest setting imaginable, and I got some much-needed rest. The first 2 days proceeded without a hitch. Lily made friends with a number of kids her own age and enjoyed the kids' club. She eagerly took part in the group activities, dance parties, and craft projects. She was described as a pleasant and well-behaved child who was a pleasure to have in the program and the counselor's excellent daily reports. She appeared to be happier than she had been in months, and I thought that spending money on this vacation was the perfect choice. But Lily's attitude took a radical turn on the third morning. She appeared hesitant to attend the day's planned activities at the kids' club after waking up crying from a nightmare she said she could not recall. She simply stated that some of the games were strange and that she no longer wanted to play them. When I asked her what was wrong, I had already arranged plans with some other adults I had met on the trip, but she pleaded with me to let her stay with me rather than go to the youth center. I accompanied Lily down to Deck 12 to make sure she was comfortable and assured her that she would enjoy herself once she arrived at the kids' club. All right. Michael Stevens reassured me that Lily would feel better if she participated in the morning's art session and that some kids eventually developed adjustment anxiety. However, as I was leaving, I saw that Lily appeared truly afraid rather than merely hesitant or homesick. One of the counselors told me that Lily had been withdrawn and disagreeable throughout the afternoon activities when I picked her up from the kids' club that afternoon. My daughter is usually gregarious, so this was quite different from her, and I wondered what had happened to cause such a drastic shift in her attitude. Lily looked hesitant to look me in the eye and made evasive responses when I questioned her about her day. Lily had another nightmare that night, and this time she was able to recall enough to share some unsettling things with me. She claimed to have dreamed of the hidden chamber where counselors would take particular kids for exclusive activities that they were not allowed to discuss with their parents. Although there were cameras in this room in her dream, they weren't the same type of security cameras found in the youth center's main rooms. Adults operating these cameras observed the kids engaging in these unique games. I made an effort to convince myself that Lily was merely using her dreams to process typical childhood anxieties. However, there was something about the particulars she detailed that made my stomach turn. Using vocabulary she could not have learnt from her peers or from age-appropriate television shows, she mentioned things an 8-year-old shouldn't know. She told me that one of the counselors had taught her these terms during a special activity period when I asked where she had heard them. I made the decision to pay closer attention to the kids' club the following morning before dropping Lily out for the day. Michael Stevens appeared center, such as a hallway that led to what looked to be private offices or storage rooms, were hidden from view by the surveillance windows. Second, it appeared that the counselors had a method for picking which kids would receive one-on-one time, consistently picking the more gregarious youngsters over the ones who were more timid or weak. Third, these chosen kids were frequently separated from the primary group activities for 15 to 20 minutes at a time. Michael Stevens described these one-on-one sessions as confidence-boosting activities meant to make introverted kids feel more at ease taking part in group activities when I questioned him about them. He claimed that these sessions were a regular component of their child development program and that some kids required more support and individualized care to get over their shyness. However, his answer seemed prepared, as though he had delivered the same spiel to worried parents numerous times. After observing the kids' club activities all morning, I started to see a trend in the way particular kids were chosen for various activities that boosted their confidence. Children traveling with single parents appeared to be the counselor's primary objective, especially mothers who were overburdened or preoccupied with the cruise experience. Additionally, they concentrated on kids who were more alone or who didn't seem to have developed close bonds with their program peers. I observed at lunchtime as one of the counselors. My daughter's face became absolutely white when a young woman called Sarah Mitchell walked up to Lily and muttered something in her ear. Then, taking Lily by the hand, Sarah guided her towards the corridor, which was out of the parents' monitoring area's line of sight that I had previously observed. Something within, even if following them meant leaving the authorized parent area, my instinct prompted me to do so. After a short delay, I informed the counselor at the check-in desk that I had to go to the toilet. I walked stealthily down the hallway where Sarah had taken Lily rather than using the loo. The hallway opened onto a number of tiny spaces that looked like they were used for staff meetings and storage. I could hear muted conversations coming from one of the rooms near the end of the hall, even though the majority of the doors were closed. I walked as stealthily as I could to the door and put my ear to it to hear what was going on inside. I felt sick to my stomach and furious as I had never felt before after hearing what I did. With a gentle, persuasive tone, Sarah Mitchell was telling Lily that this particular game would make her more well-liked by the other kids. In order for friends to see how attractive she was, she asked Lily to take off part of her clothes and pose for pictures. Lily was sobbing quietly as she expressed her disinterest in playing this game. However, Sarah insisted that it was typical and that eventually all of the kids took part in similar events. She warned Lily that the other kids would no longer want to be her friends and that she would not be permitted to take part in any of the enjoyable group activities if she did not comply. She said that I would be furious and discipline Lily for being a troublemaker if she told her mother about the special activities. I was done listening. When I opened the door, I saw my daughter standing in a tiny room's corner, just in her panties, with Sarah Mitchell holding a digital camera and giving her posing instructions. There was video equipment set up to capture center was not a program for kids. It was a highly skilled operation intended to use defenseless kids to produce illicit content. Sarah Mitchell made an attempt to pretend that she was assisting Lily in changing her costume for a dancing performance. However, the evidence in that room provided an entirely different picture. Sarah attempted to stop me from taking the camera gear as proof, but I took my kid, wrapped her in my jacket, and yelled for security. Ship security officials crowded into the room in a matter of minutes. However, I saw that they appeared more focused on maintaining control of the situation than looking into what had been going on with the kids. Robert Walsh, the ship's security chief, started pressuring me right once to remain silent about what I had found. He asserted that the cruise line has internal protocols for dealing with such situations, and that bringing in outside authorities would degrade the cruise experience for thousands of other passengers. In exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement and letting them handle the situation in private, he gave me a complaint. The other counselors were sentenced to 10-15 years in prison, while Michael Stevens was given a 25-year term. The cruise line was compelled to establish new safety procedures for all of its juvenile programs and provide millions of dollars in settlements to the families of the impacted youngsters. However, there is no way to completely fix the harm done to these kids. Lily has been undergoing treatment for the past 3 years in order to process the trauma she experienced during those brief days aboard the cruise ship. She still experiences nightmares occasionally, and her relationships with coaches, teachers, and other adults who work with children are impacted by her trust issues. I learned from the experience that predators can conceal themselves anywhere, even in settings that appear to be secure and controlled. Please keep in mind that your parental instincts are more trustworthy than any background check or company policy if you ever plan a trip with your kids. Never be scared to create a scene if you believe your child is in danger, and trust your instincts if something doesn't feel right. Parental compliance and courtesy are essential to the cruise industry. However, the safety of your child comes before the convenience or comfort of anyone. Despite their idyllic appearance, these floating cities may conceal terrible things that will always haunt your family. This is Dr. Patricia Holloway. During my 3 years as the ship's doctor on the Celebrity Constellation, I believed I had witnessed every maritime medical emergency. Heart attacks, strokes, serious injuries sustained in dick accidents, drug overdoses, alcohol poisoning, and suicide attempts. You learn to anticipate the unexpected when you are in charge of the health and safety of 4,000 passengers and crew members in the middle of the ocean. Then came the evening that a traveler was brought in with inexplicable injuries. I also came to the realization that not all emergencies are medical in nature. After completing my emergency medicine residency at Johns Hopkins, I began working on cruise ships. The work was difficult enough to keep me interested without being overwhelming. The travel chances were amazing, and the money was great. On cruise ships, the majority of medical problems are common: minor wounds, medication refills, seasickness, and the sporadic major illness that necessitates a helicopter evacuation to the closest hospital. The Constellation's medical bay was state-of-the-art, equipped with surgical tools, diagnostic equipment, and even a small morgue in case any passengers passed away while traveling. The truth about what transpired in international waters would have perished with me if the Hippocratic Oath had not forced me to record everything, if my medical education had not equipped me to spot the warning signs of purposeful trauma, and if I had not refused to give a thorough examination in spite of pressure from ship management. However, I vowed as a doctor to do no harm and to stand up for my patients, even if doing so endangered my safety and career. In September 2019, the incident happened during a 14-night transatlantic flight from Miami to Barcelona. Around 3 a.m., security brought a passenger to the medical bay 6 days into the journey, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The man was unconscious, bleeding from several wounds to his head, and his body and extremities were severely damaged by blunt force trauma. He had fallen down a flight of stairs while intoxicated, according to the security guards who brought him in. However, even a quick check showed injuries that couldn't have been caused by an ordinary fall. David Chen, a 42-year-old San Francisco software engineer who was taking his maiden cruise alone, was recognized as the patient. Based on his medical history, he had no serious health problems in the past and was in fantastic health. No past, drug usage, and no prescription drugs other than those for sporadic allergy relief. He reserved an internal cabin on deck 4 and was by himself for the majority of the voyage, exercising by pacing the decks outside and reading in the library. As soon as I started my inspection, I saw that David's injuries showed a pattern that pointed to intentional assault rather than unintentional harm. He had attempted to defend himself from an attack, as evidenced by the defensive wounds on his wrists and forearms. Instead of striking his head during a fall, the head injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly with a blunt object. The ligature marks on his wrist, which suggested he had been confined during the attack, and the bruises around his throat, which showed physical strangling, were the most telling. Using the same procedures I would do in a hospital emergency department when tending to victims of violent crimes, I took pictures and made thorough notes of everything. However, I was informed that Head Walsh was not accessible and that any medical concerns should be addressed through the Guest Services Department until morning, when I attempted to contact the ship's security head to report that David Chen had been the victim of an attempted murder rather than a drunken accident. Within minutes of my contact, Guest Services dispatched a representative to the medical bay. However, they were more interested in managing information regarding the incident than looking into David's assault. Lisa Martinez, the agent, started questioning me right away about who else was aware of David's condition and whether I had spoken to any outs. In order to save his life, he needed emergency surgery to treat his severe concussion, many cracked ribs, and internal bleeding. I continued thinking about how his injuries had been caused and who may have wished to harm a lone, peaceful passenger who appeared to have no enemies on board as I tried to save his life. David momentarily regained consciousness at around 6 in the morning, and he told me something that chilled my blood during those brief moments of clarity. He muttered that another traveler had not attacked him. When crew members realized he wasn't who he claimed to be, they attacked him. David Chen wasn't on vacation as a software engineer. He was an investigative journalist working undercover to write a piece about organized crime on cruise liners. David claims that he had been looking into claims of human trafficking schemes that transported victims covertly across international borders using cruise ships, evidence that certain crew members were collaborating with criminal groups to smuggle persons, drugs, and other illicit goods using the cruise industry's extensive port network and inadequate security protocols. For months, he had been compiling information, recording questionable activities, and identifying crew members who had participated in the operation. David informed me that the evening of his attack, he had, at our most recent port call, I was discovered taking pictures of a meeting between a number of crew members and people who had entered the ship illegally. These folks were being transferred against their will as part of a trafficking network. They were not passengers with the appropriate paperwork. The crew members who apprehended David beat him almost to death when he attempted to flee after being found, then took him to the medical bay while fabricating a tale about a drunken tumble. David pleaded with me to call the FBI and inform them of the evidence he had stashed in his cabin before he passed out once more. He said that his inquiry would end with him and that his death would be declared an accident. He forced me to swear that even if it meant jeopardizing my personal safety to reveal the truth, I would not allow them to hide what he had found. Ship management put a lot of pressure on me over the course of the following few hours to change my medical records. To back up the official account that David had been hurt in an unintentional fall, Robert Morrison, the ship's captain, personally visited the medical bay to remind me that I was not allowed to communicate passenger medical information with third parties due to confidentiality terms in my employment contract. He said that discussing David's illness with law authorities would be against these agreements and would lead to my termination right away. However, I resisted being threatened. As David's doctor, it was my moral and legal duty to accurately record his injuries and notify the proper authorities of any suspected criminal behavior. Even if it meant ruining my own cruise industry career, I had a moral duty to comply with his request to reveal the trafficking ring he had uncovered. 3 days later, David was still alive but in serious condition when we arrived in Barcelona. His injuries had been stabilized by me, but he was still unconscious and would need intensive care at a shoreside hospital. Lisa Martinez from Guest Services came up to me with a pre-written death certificate that said that David's cause of death was accidental trauma from a fall while the medical evacuation team got ready to take him to a hospital in Spain. When I learnt that they intended me to fabricate a death certificate for a patient who was still alive. I was appalled. Martinez said that David would not survive the helicopter trip to the hospital and that my signature on the death certificate was required to speed up the procedure of informing his family and handling his remains when I refused to sign the document. She made it apparent that signing would have a major impact on my future work and that cooperation was required. I became aware that I was doing more than just tending to an attack victim at that very moment. I was requested to assist in the cover-up by presenting fictitious medical papers while I watched a murder take place. In order to keep David from disclosing their trafficking scheme, the cruise line intended to have him killed during the evacuation. And they wanted me to use fake documents to justify his murder. Before signing any paperwork, I informed Martinez that I needed some time to go over David's medical records. I then used the ship's satellite communication equipment to get in touch with the FBI right away. I gave them copies of all of my medical records, pictures of David's wounds, and a thorough description of all he had shared with me regarding the trafficking inquiry. In order for them to obtain any evidence he had gathered, I also provided them with the address of his cabin. In response, when our ship docked in Barcelona, the FBI worked with Spanish officials to meet it. Under police, Hippocratic oath occasionally demands that doctors risk everything to uphold morality. If you ever experience a medical emergency while on a cruise ship, keep in mind that the ship's doctor can be under a lot of pressure to put business interests ahead of patient care. If anything doesn't feel right, follow your gut and don't be afraid to request an outside medical evacuation if you think your safety is in jeopardy. Even though the ocean may be wide, the truth will eventually come to light, especially when there are people who are prepared to take any and all risks to ensure that it is heard. I was persuaded to accept a position as deck crew by my friend, Jake. Meet women, travel the world, and earn money, he declared. The hazing procedure that new crew members had to go through in the ship's lowest decks, and the reality that employees who attempted to resign frequently ended up drowning on there. Last night, there were two things he neglected to mention. I'm Brandon Walsh, and when I was 20 years old, I believed that working on the Royal Caribbean Voyager of the Seas would be an incredible experience. Rather, it turned into a nightmare that made me realize the real price of using cheap labor in foreign waters. The largest employment in the small Ohio town where I grew up was a plant that shut down when I was 16. The majority of my peers were either leaving home to work minimal pay jobs with no prospects for the future, or were going to college with enormous student loan debt. Signing up seemed like the natural choice for someone with no money and no prospects. When Jake returned from his first cruise ship contract with designer clothes, pricey equipment, and tales of partying in far-flung destinations, the hiring procedure was shockingly simple. In just 6 weeks, I was flying to Miami to join the crew of a ship that transported over 4,000 passengers and employed close to 2,000 workers from dozens of various nations after completing an online application and passing a basic medical check. The 8-month contract had no vacation time, but the salary appeared fair and came with free housing and board. There was also the chance to save money because there were no expenses when at sea. I never would have seen what they did to employees who attempted to leave before their contracts expired if crew hierarchy had not been upheld by violence and terror, if new hires had been adequately briefed about the conditions in the lower decks, and if I had realized that leaving meant signing a death warrant rather than simply breaking a contract. However, cruise companies rely on desperate individuals who are without other choices, and they employ intimidation and seclusion to keep their employees quiet and cooperative. On cruise liners, the staff quarters are situated in the ship's bowels, in windowless passageways that smell of industrial cleaner and diesel fuel, many decks below the guest areas. With 2 small bunk beds, a small sink, and a communal restroom down the hall that accommodated 20 other crew members, my cabin was hardly bigger than a closet. The ship's engines caused the thin metal walls to tremble continuously. Additionally, the temperature was constantly too hot or too cold due to the inadequate air circulation. During my first week on board, I was paired with Carlos Martinez, a 35-year-old Filipino deckhand with over 10 years of experience working on cruise ships. Carlos gave off the impression of being amiable during the day. However, I observed that any time we were in the crew areas, particularly when specific other crew members were around, he became uncomfortable and anxious. He advised me to focus on my work, keep my head down, and refrain from inquiring about matters that were not my concern. The labor was physically taxing. Working 12-hour shifts in all weather conditions, they handled garbage disposal, moved supplies, maintained equipment, and cleaned decks. Because we worked while the passengers slept or ate, and because we had to blend in whenever they used the outdoor spaces, the passengers never noticed us during the day. Despite being the unseen workers that kept the ship running, we were treated more like pieces of equipment than like people. When I met Dimitri Popescu, a Romanian employee who had been attempting to terminate his contract for more than a month during my second week, it was the first indication that something was very wrong. Dimitri had agreed to a 6-month contract, but after 3 months of grueling labor and almost no pay because of exorbitant food and lodging costs, he wanted to get off the ship at the next port and go back to his family. However, crew members were not permitted to just go and disembark, Dimitri said. He was held financially liable for hiring, training, and transportation costs that exceeded his earnings during his job according to provisions in the contract he had signed, making an effort to depart prior to he and his family would face legal action in Romania if the entire contract was completed, which might result in the confiscation of their house and belongings. Dimitri attempted to speak with Romanian authorities regarding his predicament, but management kept an eye on and managed ship communications. He had also made an effort to communicate with port officials during beach excursions. Nevertheless, crew members were always under security guard supervision when they went ashore for work-related purposes and were not permitted to leave the ship on their own. In essence, he was ensnared in a financial bondage system that forced him to labor in appalling conditions with no realistic prospect of freedom. The fact that Dimitri wasn't by himself added to the unsettling nature of his circumstances. In my 3rd week on board, I discovered that several crew members were facing comparable circumstances, working under contracts they couldn't afford, to terminate an accruing debt that made their jobs seem increasingly precarious. With the promise of decent pay and career growth, many had been lured from underprivileged neighborhoods, only to find that the reality was more akin to contemporary slavery than respectable employment. A group of senior officers who had worked for the corporation for decades oversaw the ship's crew management. They kept control by using a combination of physical threats and financial trickery. Hazing ceremonies were performed on new crew members with the intention of depressing them and creating the order that kept everyone in line. The worst employment and the riskiest working conditions were given to anyone who complained or caused issues until they either fell in line or ended up in potentially hazardous situations. When compared to what occurred to crew members who were thought to be troublemakers, the hazing I went through during my first month was rather moderate. I was given cleaning tasks that exposed me to hazardous chemicals without the appropriate safety gear, made to work additional shifts without compensation, and verbally abused by senior crew members. However, other new hires received far worse treatment, including as hours of incarceration in storage compartments for small offenses, physical beatings, and sexual abuse. The total lack of supervision or worker protection was the most horrifying feature of living in the crew quarters. Due to the ship's operation under flags of convenience that offered scant labor rights and the fact that it was in international seas, standard legal protections were not applicable. When crew members were hurt on the job, they frequently faced pressure to keep working despite having major health issues and received little medical care. Regardless of their capacity to return home or provide for themselves, those who became too ill or injured to work were merely released at the next port. When I saw what happened to Miguel Santos, a Filipino employee who had been attempting to rally other crew members to demand better working conditions, during my 6th week on board, it was the tipping point. When we got to our next port in Jamaica, Miguel was gathering information regarding labor law infractions and preparing to file a formal complaint with port authorities. However, he was chosen for what senior crew members referred to as DP cleaning duty in one of the ship's most hazardous sections before he could do anything about it. Deep cleaning entailed handling hazardous materials, running hazardous machinery without adequate safety monitoring, and working alone in the ship's waste processing facilities. It was usually given to crew members as a form of discipline when they broke the rules or caused issues for the management. Miguel had to work the night shift at these locations, which were far from other crew members and lacked radio capabilities in case of an emergency. I was working late in a nearby storage area on Miguel's third night of deep cleaning duty when I heard noises coming from the trash processing compartment about a battle. During my investigation, I discovered that 3 senior crew members were holding Miguel down while a 4th man, whom I knew to be from the ship's security team, pressed a cloth drenched in some sort of chemical over his face. Despite Miguel's valiant efforts, the poison soon knocked him out. While these men debated what to do with Miguel's unconscious body, I crouched behind some equipment and watched in terror. They discussed his accident, which would happen later. That evening when he was working alone on the outside decks and unintentionally fell overboard. They stated that Miguel's disappearance would be recorded as a workplace accident with no witnesses or proof of foul play, and that this was regular policy for handling crew members who caused issues. Their casual discussion about Miguel's murder, as though it were simply another mundane chore that needed to be finished, was the most terrifying aspect of their exchange. They discussed how his personal things would be disposed of to remove any indication that he had been planning to report labor infractions, as well as when he would fall to make sure the ship would be too far from land for any rescue attempt. I came to see that in addition to Miguel's murder, I was also seeing proof of a planned campaign to kill crew members posing a threat to the ship's ability to operate. Any worker who attempted to organize opposition or reveal the conditions in the crew quarters would be subjected to the same treatment by these men, who had obviously done this before. Because the cruise line operated in international waters, with little regulation and easy disposal of evidence, they were essentially getting away with murder. I hid in that storage compartment for the remainder of the night after the men left with Miguel's unconscious body, because I was too scared to move or make any noise that would draw attention. Despite quick search attempts, Miguel Santos, a crew member, was considered dead after falling overboard in a terrible event that occurred during the night shift, according to the ship's intercom, which was announced around dawn. After less than 24 hours, the official investigation into Miguel's disappearance came to the conclusion that he had fallen while working alone on the outside decks. His body had not been found, and his family in the Philippines was informed of his passing. His widow, who lacked the means to question the cruise line's account of events or look into the circumstances behind her husband's death, received a paltry payout from the corporation. I was aware that I needed to leave the ship to avoid being the next casualty. However, I was also aware that attempting to stop would probably lead to Miguel's demise. Rather, I started meticulously organizing my escape, recording what I had seen, and getting ready to jump ship at our next port call, regardless of the financial or legal repercussions. I was able to elude the supervised crew shore leave when we docked at Cosmol and get in touch with Mexican police. I gave them comprehensive details on Miguel's murder as well as the ship's crew members' institutionalized mistreatment. The ensuing inquiry revealed labor practices that broke various international regulations and resulted in the arrest of several crew management members. However, Miguel Santos was never located, and his murder was never prosecuted. Ships continue to function as floating labor camps devoid of basic human rights, and the cruise industry continues to take advantage of desperate laborers from developing nations. Every day, invisible workers risk their lives to serve passengers who will never know their identities or recognize their humanity. Keep this in mind the next time you enjoy the comfort and elegance of a cruise trip. At 65, I believed I was too old for adventure. My name is Veronica Hamilton. Harold, my late husband, however, had a lifelong desire to go on a lavish cruise. 6 months after his funeral, I decided to pay tribute to him by reserving the most costly suite on the Celebrity Edge. During that journey, I learned that having money and prestige can grant you access to things that are unthinkable for most people. However, there are some of those events that are so terrible that money cannot make them go away. After 42 years of marriage, Harold passed away from pancreatic cancer within 3 months of his diagnosis. When we retired, we intended to take a globe tour together. However, his disease dominated our last years, with hospital stays, therapies, and the steady decline of the man I had known since college. Surrounded by casseroles and condolence cards from well-meaning neighbors who couldn't possibly comprehend the emptiness of a house that had been shared for 40 years, I felt lost and aimless after his funeral. Harold had left me comfortable, and I intended to enjoy the kind of lavish trip we had only fantasized about while we were middle class together. even if the luxury suite I reserved cost more than most people make in a year. A personal butler, priority dinner reservations, exclusive access to exclusive areas of the ship, and, most fascinating of all, invitations to unique events that were only open to the highest-paying passengers were all included in the renowned Suite on Deck 14. I never would have learnt about the ship's most exclusive and lethal form of recreation if I hadn't been invited to the captain's private dinner because of my wealth and status, if I hadn't been intrigued enough to accept an invitation that seemed too exclusive to turn down, and if I hadn't followed the other elite passengers out of the formal dining room for what they called the real entertainment. With every luxury possible, the Celebrity Edge was a floating castle. There were several specialty eateries, Broadway-style performances, and a spa with unusual treatments. With Florida to ceiling, windows, a separate living space, and a private balcony overlooking the vast Caribbean Sea, my suite was larger than several residences. Although I was traveling without Harold for the first time in decades, my personal butler, Eduardo, a discreet Filipino man, took care of all of my needs and made sure I never felt lonely. Eduardo graciously invited Captain Morrison and a few other notable guests to what was billed as an exclusive dining experience on the third night of the 7-day voyage. The invitation, which was printed on thick paper with gold embossing, said that formal evening attire was required, and that attendance was by invitation only. Eduardo clarified that I should feel privileged to be with such prestigious company and that these dinners were legendary among frequent luxury travelers. The captain's private dining room, a sophisticated setting behind the bridge that I was unaware of, served as the venue for the supper. 12 people were on the guest list, all of whom were traveling in the priciest suites and represented Middle Eastern oil executives, tech billionaires from California, European aristocrats, and old money families from New York. Although the wine selection was exceptional and the conversation was intelligent, there was a sense of expectation that this evening was only the prelude to something bigger. A distinguished man in his 50s, Captain Morrison, spoke passionately about maritime customs and the special advantages of leading a ship in international seas. He started talking about the idea of ultimate experiences as the evening went on. They could only be fully appreciated by those who had the means and discretion to do so. He discussed how contemporary society had grown docile and predictable, and how real adventure necessitated eschewing accepted morality and legal constraints. Around 11 p.m., the formal supper came to an end. During what he described as a presentation of the most unique entertainment available any place in the globe, Captain Morrison invited the guests to join him. The majority of the guests appeared to understand what this meant, and they excitedly followed him through a number of hallways that I had never seen before, leading to parts of the ship that were inaccessible to most crew members or even ordinary passengers. We went past the crew, quarters and service rooms, and down many levels beneath the passenger decks to what looked to be a specifically built facility in the ship's deepest hull. The area had been transformed into a lavish hunting lodge complete with leather furnishings, mounted animal heads, and high-end audio-visual equipment. However, a big viewing screen that displayed real-time video from what looked to be a far-off tropical island served as the room's focal point. According to Captain Morrison, the ship's itinerary called for a stop at a private island that was owned by a group of affluent people who had bought it expressly to offer their most discerning customers exclusive recreational activities. Visits were never noted in the ship's logs or passenger registers, and the island was not listed on any official charts. He reassured us that what transpired there remained there forever. The video displayed on the television depicted a verdant jungle setting with clearings that were transformed into a variety of recreational spaces. However, upon closer inspection, I saw that the facilities were essentially sophisticated hunting grounds, with us as the prey. The screen showed hunters, with powerful weapons and tracking devices pursuing frightened individuals as they ran through the bush. An oiler executive from Dubai, one of the other visitors, remarked in passing that the prey included political dissidents, homeless people, undocumented immigrants, people that society would not miss, and others who had been bought especially for this reason. He explained how every hunting trip was meticulously organized to offer the participants the most entertainment and challenge possible, with various terrain and obstacles meant to put the hunter's abilities to the test. As the other guests talked about their past hunting trips, comparing tactics and exchanging tales of their most difficult kills, I sat in stunned silence. By evaluating their performances according to the length of time the victims lived and the inventiveness with which the hunters had killed them, they discussed humans as though they were trophy animals. Laughter and casual remarks regarding the entertainment value of witnessing individuals die in fear were interspersed throughout the conversation. Captain Morrison declared that 6 new specimens, carefully chosen for their physical prowess and survival instincts, would be included in tomorrow's trip to the private island. He said that the hunting group would be outfitted with cutting-edge weapons and tracking gear, while each victim had been provided with minimal provisions and an early advantage in the forest. For those who would rather observe than take part directly, the hunt would be streamed live to the watching room. Participation in the search cost $50,000 per person, while admission to the observation area cost $25,000. According to Captain Morrison, passenger fares by themselves could never provide the caliber of amenities and service that discriminating tourists demanded, and the money raised from these events helped cover the operating expenses of offering luxury cruise experiences. As the evening went on, I came to understand that I was seeing proof of a systematic operation that had been going on for years, not just the preparation of few murders. These individuals' casual discussion about murdering people for sport implied that this was a tried and true business strategy, and that wealthy psychopaths who could afford to indulge in their most twisted dreams frequently visited the private island. Around 2 a.m., the presentation came to a conclusion, and the other attendees started organizing the events for the next day. While some choose to observe from the ship's observation lounge, the majority decided to take part in the search personally. I was able to murmur something about needing time to think about such a big purchase when Captain Morrison asked for my choice. I stayed in my suite for the remainder of the night. I was appalled by what I had seen and afraid of what would occur if these individuals discovered that I wasn't one of them. I had wandered into a world devoid of any value for human life, beyond its capacity for amusement and where affluence gave access to the most heinous kinds of leisure. I informed Eduardo the following morning that I was feeling under the weather and would not be going on any shore excursions. As the hunting group left for their own island, I stayed in my suite and kept the door shut. I saw a smaller vessel departing the ship via my balcony window, carrying people who would be spending the day killing innocent people for fun. The hunting team was enjoying their successful adventure when they returned that evening. Outside my suite, I could hear them giggling and congratulating one another on their kills in the hallways. I became physically ill from their casual discussion about taking human lives, and I avoided all interaction with the other privileged guests for the rest of the cruise. I called the FBI right away to report what I had seen when we got back to Fort Lauderdale. However, it might be challenging to investigate crimes that take place in foreign waterways, and it takes hard to find proof to demonstrate the existence of a private island used for human hunts. Although the inquiry is still underway, I don't think the victims who lost their lives to amuse those affluent monsters will ever receive justice. I don't want to profit from wealth that allowed me to witness such evil, so I donated Harold's life insurance money to charities that aid missing people and victims of human trafficking. Although money can buy comfort and luxury, it can also offer access to evil that most people cannot possibly fathom. Remember that some experiences are exclusive for very good reasons the next time you witness affluent people on a cruise ship, taking advantage of special treatment. This is Captain Rodriguez. I believed I understood every emergency procedure in the book after 30 years at sea. I had experienced every calamity that could happen to a ship transporting thousands of people through the most hazardous waters on Earth, including hurricanes, technical issues, medical emergencies, and more. However, the corporate rulebook instructed me to do something that went against everything I held dear as a human being and as a mariner. When Hurricane Isabella struck us with 40-foot surges and gusts of 100 miles per hour, Hurricane Isabella was the turning point in my career. My name is Captain Miguel Rodriguez, and I had been in charge of cruise ships for Carnival Corporation for more than 20 years. After graduating from Spain's Maritime Academy as a deck officer, I progressed through all of the bridge's positions and obtained my captain's license after years of commitment to passenger safety and nautical excellence. By 2018, I was in charge of the large ship Carnival Horizon, which could accommodate more than 4,000 passengers and 1,500 staff members. Hurricane Isabella formed abruptly in the Gulf of Mexico when the Horizon was on a 7-day Western Caribbean schedule. In less than 18 hours, it grew from a tropical depression to a Category 4 hurricane. Hurricanes can still surprise seasoned sailors with their abrupt shifts in intensity and direction, even with the help of advanced modern weather prediction technologies. We had already made up our minds to follow a path that would put us straight into the storm's path by the time we realized its actual strength. I would never have been told to abandon passengers in lifeboats in order to protect the company's reputation and financial liability if maritime law had not been subordinated to corporate profit margins, if passenger safety had been the top priority in emergency protocols, and if I had been free to make decisions based on my experience, rather than obeying directives from executives who had never set foot at sea. On our 4th day at sea, we were about 200 meters southwest of Jamaica when the first indication of disaster appeared. Hurricane Isabella was fast increasing and heading towards us, according to the ship's weather routing system, but corporate headquarters in Miami told me to keep my course and speed constant to prevent any disruptions to the scheduled itinerary. Since the travelers had paid for 7 days of Caribbean sunshine, altering the itinerary would necessitate expensive refunds and rescheduling, which would impact thousands of future reservations. By pointing them that Hurricane Isabella was predicted to reach Category 4 strength with sustained winds above 130 miles, I objected to this decision through the appropriate channels. Although cruise ships are built to withstand inclement weather, none of them are made to function properly during hurricanes, particularly when transporting guests who have never experienced severe weather at sea. In response, the firm said that my worries were overly alarmist and that contemporary ships could withstand any storm. Hurricane Isabella had developed into a monster storm by the 5th day, with an eye wall more than 30 miles wide and wind speeds higher than those of any cruise ship ever constructed. We will experience the worst conditions probably in the early morning hours of our 6th day, because the storm was heading northwest at 15 knots. Corporate headquarters told me to keep going towards our planned port stop in Cosmos when I asked for authorization to divert to the closest port for passenger evacuation. The financial consequences of travel cancellations worried Miami's executives more than the physical security of the individuals I was in charge of. They estimated that while surviving the storm at sea would only result in a few uncomfortable hours, and possibly minor damage that could be fixed in between voyages, evacuating guests would cost millions in refunds, hotel stays, and transportation expenses. Financial models that viewed passengers as revenue units rather than human beings served as the sole foundation for their risk assessment. I received a confidential message from corporate headquarters the night before we faced Hurricane Isabella's full fury. It included emergency procedures I had never seen in my decades of nautical experience. These regulations described how to control the number of passengers amid severe weather conditions, which was corporate jargon for determining which passengers would be spared in the case of a ship disaster. These procedures called for the deployment of lifeboats in the event of a complete vessel loss scenario based on a passenger priority system that took into account variables like ticket price, status in a loyalty program, potential legal liability, and the impact on public relations. Suite passengers were identified as priority assets that needed to be safeguarded at all means to prevent bad press and litigation from affluent families, while inside cabin passengers who had paid the lowest prices were categorized as expendable inventory. Lower priority passengers were to be sent to secondary evacuation places if the lifeboat's capacity could not accommodate all of the passengers and staff, according to the rules. In fact, several parts of the ship had little realistic hope of survival, while other lifeboats were non-operational. This approach was justified by the argument that some passenger deaths during severe weather events were unavoidable, and that it was preferable to control which passengers perished rather than letting chance determine who survived. On our 6th day, Hurricane Isabella made landfall at the Carnival Horizon at 3 a.m., with waves as high as 40 feet and gusts over 140 miles an hour. Our stabilization devices were soon overpowered by the storm's ferocity, as the ship was only built to withstand surges of up to 30 feet. When passengers awoke to a nightmare of shattered glass, flooded hallways, and the horrifying sound of a ship's hull being torn apart by natural forces, they had been hoping for another enjoyable day of Caribbean cruise. 3 of our 6 primary yaw engines lost power during the first hour of the storm, and water intrusion caused the backup electrical systems to start malfunctioning. Because of the damage to the ship's communication systems, it was not feasible to send precise distress signals or even cooperate with Coast Guard rescue operations. Most importantly, even if we had been prepared to surrender passengers to the storm, the ship's tremendous motion prevented the safe deployment of lifeboats. The Carnival Horizon was clearly in grave danger of experiencing a catastrophic structural failure by 500 a.m. A number of lower decks were flooding more quickly than the pumping systems could manage, and the ship's hull was sustaining stress loads that were greater than those allowed by design. Knowing that we might only have 2 hours left before the ship was rendered fully inoperable or worse, I decided to start the emergency evacuation procedures. I got my last orders from corporate headquarters at that point. I was told to carry out the passenger load management procedures and give priority to the evacuation of high-value passengers while guiding others to locations where they could not obstruct the evacuation process, even though there was clear danger to all passengers and crew. The business was more focused on preventing wrongful death claims from wealthy families than it was on preserving as many lives as possible. According to the directives, guests in lower deck inside cabins were to be informed that the evacuation was going according to plan, and that, for their own safety, they should stay in their cabins. Using the few available lifeboats, suite guests, and those with high-tier loyalty status were to be discreetly evacuated first. The rationale was that passengers with higher incomes were more likely to have relatives who would take the corporation to court and demand high fees. In order to keep investigators from finding proof of the selective evacuation procedures, I was also instructed to make sure that the ship's data storage systems were destroyed before leaving the ship. Intentional abandoning of lower-income passengers would result in criminal charges and billions of dollars in responsibility, while random passenger deaths during a hurricane might be justified as natural disasters, according to the company's legal department. I had to make the hardest decision of my professional life at that precise moment. I could save the passengers who were most important to the company's financial success while adhering to business directives. Alternatively, I could disregard those directives and work to save as many individuals as I can, irrespective of their financial situation. While ignoring orders would probably end in criminal charges and the destruction of everything I had worked for during my 30 years at sea, following them would secure my career and pension. I decided to start an emergency instead of following the evacuation procedures. Protocols intended to save as many lives as possible, not only the most lucrative travelers. I placed an order for everything. Available staff members, regardless of cabin, to help in passenger evacuation category. Additionally, I ensured that preferential access was granted to families with children. Regardless of the cost of their tickets, they were transported to lifeboats. The passenger priority system used by the company was ethically repugnant, and I declined to enact laws that prioritized human lives according to the amount in their bank accounts. It took almost 4 hours under circumstances that ought to have prevented it. Crew members put their lives at danger to assist passengers in getting to lifeboat stations, and other individuals displayed bravery that far exceeded their duties related to work. More than 90% of the passengers and crew were able to enter lifeboats before the Hurricane Isabella's eventual destruction of the Carnival Horizon and disintegrated early in the afternoon. The subsequent rescue effort was organized by the U.S. Coast Guard and included ships from several nations cooperating to gather survivors from dozens of dispersed lifeboats across hundreds of square kilometers of water destroyed by hurricanes. There were 138 passengers killed in all, crew members who perished in the storm, some of whom were lost when lifeboats overturned in the choppy waters, and others who perished from exposure before arriving rescue vessels. The ensuing corporate inquiry concentrated solely on my choice to disregard evacuation procedures, rather than on the regulations that initially established those processes. I was fired right away and had to deal with criminal prosecution for violating established protocols and putting passengers in danger. The business stated that if I had adhered to their selected evacuation protocol, more lives could have been saved, and they exploited my using disobedience as a cover for the catastrophe. However, the voyage was actually made public by Hurricane Isabella. The real priorities of the industry when it comes to passenger safety and business earnings. The procedures for managing the passenger load. I was instructed to adhere to a methodical strategy that would sacrifice the lives of less wealthy travelers in order to safeguard the business from costly legal actions. Every significant cruise line has these rules. Line. Concealed in private. Records that the majority of captains never view until they are forced to put ideas into practice in actual circumstances. I lost my pension, my job, and my renown for not letting go of customers because of the amount they paid for their tickets. However, I can endure the repercussions, as I am aware that I put human dignity ahead of allegiance to the company when it counted most. The cruise industry continues to make billions of dollars through the sale of the appearance of safety for travelers who are unaware of the importance of their lives differently according to their financial situation. The next time you make a cruise reservation, remember that the cost of your ticket could influence whether you are saved or left to perish in the event of an emergency. C. On a cruise ship, food poisoning is every passenger's nightmare. However, what I found at 2 a.m. in the galley's freezer made me aware of some diseases weren't by chance. I'm Michelle Thompson, and I oversaw the culinary service on the Norwegian Escape about 2 years prior to my discovery of a systematic poisoning scheme that targeted particular passenger groups for reasons that were entirely related to corporate damage control and had nothing to do with food safety. I began, after completing culinary school, working on cruise ships, believing that overseeing food service for thousands of it would be a great experience to work with people when I finally opened my own restaurant. More than 200 people were employed by the Norwegian Escape. Almost 20,000 meals are prepared daily by the kitchen crew throughout many dining locations, food stations, and room service services. There was a huge logistical difficulty that needed careful planning and rigorous attention to food safety regulations in order to avoid outbreaks that could cause costly lawsuits and ruin a cruise. The galley's activities were conducted continuously, with several shifts in charge of making breakfast, serving lunch, making dinner, and cleaning up after hours, tidying up, and getting ready for the next day. As a supervisor, I was in charge of inventory management and quality assurance, administration, as well as guaranteeing adherence to health department rules that were purportedly enforced by routine examinations. I learned that certain of those rules were being purposefully breached in order to fulfill objectives unrelated to passenger nutrition. Had I not been working the nighttime shift when the special dinner was served, and had the health inspector not been paid, if I hadn't seen the meal meant for a certain passenger being systematically contaminated, preparations would have taken place. Groups. The scale of the poisoned operation would never have been achieved. However, cruise lines make billions in revenue, and a portion of that sum is used to make sure issues are resolved before they have a chance to harm the business's profitability or repute. During my 3rd month on board, the first sign that something was amiss was when I observed odd trends in the food poisoning cases reported to the ship's medical facility. Generally on cruise ships, foodborne illnesses strike passengers at random and are transmitted by tainted food or buffet lines, components that have an effect on everyone who eats them. However, it appeared that the examples I was observing were concentrated in particular categories. Travelers who complained to guest services, relatives who threatened to sue for a variety of problems, as well as those who had been bothering other passengers or the crew. The head cook of the ship, these correlations were described as coincidental by a Frenchman named Philippe Dubois, who suggested that specific due to weakened immune systems or a propensity for overindulging, passengers were more likely to become ill. Rich foods. Additionally, he noted that those who had grievances on other elements of their cruise experience were innately inclined to attribute their ailments on the food service, even when the source of the contamination may have been seaside trips or their own unsanitary habits. However, when I kept reading the medical papers, I thought these illnesses' occurrences were too regular to be coincidental. Travelers would complain or bring about disturbances, and they would be restricted to their cabins for 24 to 48 hours. With serious stomach issues that successfully removed them as issues for the rest of the take a cruise. Although the medical bay would treat their symptoms, it hardly ever looked into the contamination's origin. Usually travel-related stomach upsets rather than food poisoning were blamed for instances. The trend turned into when I began linking the illness reports with airline manifest information and visitor incident reports for services. Travelers who had voiced their displeasure with nearby cabin noise sought reimbursement for unsatisfactory shore excursions or threats to leave unfavorable internet reviews were statistically significantly more likely to contract food poisoning than those who remained silent and did not interfere with the crew's work. The finding that some passenger groups were targeted more frequently than others was unsettling. Those who traveled alone and reserved inside cabins were more at risk, as were older travelers who might have been on fixed means and had lower likely to have relatives who would look into any unusual medical conditions. It appeared that the targeting was intended to have an impact. Travelers who are least likely to file a lawsuit or produce unfavorable advertising for the cruise line. When I was working the overnight shift during my 6th month on board, I made the breakthrough. Inventory change and found a distinct space for food preparation that wasn't a part of the typical galley. Activities. A service corridor that linked to the main entrance provided access to this region. Kitchen, but it was separate from the areas where food is normally prepared. This area's equipment was the same as what we typically use to prepare meals, but it was being used for things unrelated to passenger food. I watched as a number of crew members prepared what seemed to be standard buffet fare, but they were adding items to the food that were unquestionably not typical. The unmarked canisters kept in a closed refrigerated unit provided additions, and the crew members wearing masks and protective gloves, indicating that the drugs were possibly harmful. One of the crew members seemed really anxious when I asked him what they were doing. They asserted that they were cooking meals for travelers with special dietary needs. However, specific special orders could not be fulfilled because to the enormous amounts being manufactured and the ingredients being added didn't fit any of the acceptable dietary adjustments I knew about from my culinary education. In the weeks that followed, I started recording the events in this particular region for preparation, noting which crew members were involved, the ingredients being added to the food, and the timing of the serving of these tainted meals to travelers. The process was intricate and well-planned, with particular food batches being identified by codes that matched specific dining establishments and hours of service. The tainted food was usually provided by the midnight buffet, which was well-liked by travelers seeking late-night munchies. Other possibilities for an early breakfast. The buffet arrangement makes it simple to focus on particular products that particular passenger categories were more inclined to select, including lighter fare that catered to senior citizens passengers or cost-effective choices that drew passengers who were attempting to consume less expensive food in order to save money. The ingredients being included in the food seemed to be drugs intended to induce gastrointestinal distress without producing any symptoms, severe enough to necessitate helicopter evacuation or immediate medical attention. Carefully determined amounts were used to render passengers incapacitated for a number of days, while steering clear of issues that could result in significant legal responsibility or regulatory scrutiny. However, the method used to identify passenger targeting was a troubling feature of the operation. Daily reports were used to inform the decisions regarding who should be poisoned. Security, guest services, and other divisions that recognized travelers who were creating issues or endangering the brand of the cruise line. The special food preparation crew received the target lists created from the reports, and they made sure that certain travelers were served tainted food. The rationale, because the only motivation behind this systematic poisoning was money. Travelers who fell ill were less likely to take advantage of shore excursions, spa treatments, specialty dining, and other activities while on their trip. Actions that generate income. More significantly, individuals who were ill were less most likely to lodge official grievances, request reimbursements, or take legal action due to they didn't pursue their complaints since they were too preoccupied with getting better from their illness. Additionally, the procedure functioned as a behavioral control measure that deterred passengers from voicing grievances or making requests that could result in financial losses for the cruise business. Word got out. Passengers who raised trouble appeared to get sick more frequently, and many decided to accept this fact. Poor service instead of running the danger of contracting unexplained food sickness again. when I eventually got together sufficient proof to demonstrate what was taking place, I had to make the same decision as any cruise ship employee who finds criminal activities. I can either report it and lose my job or keep quiet and join forces to cause harm to innocent people. I decided to get in touch with the CDC and give them thorough records of the poisoning incident, including pictures of the tainted food, preparation, copies of the passenger target lists, and samples of the chemicals being employed. The inquiry that resulted in significant fines for Norwegian crews and criminal accusations against other crew members, penalty for breaking food safety laws. However, the most significant result was revealing how cruise lines employ food service as a weapon to thwart customers who pose a risk to their earnings, transforming a simple act like eating into a corporate form of revenge. Intentional poisoning. In the cruise industry, problematic passengers are more common than anyone would like to acknowledge. And it goes on because rather than being deliberate, passengers usually blame their ailments on overindulgence or the stress of traveling. Contamination. In particular, the next time you contract food illness while on a cruise ship, if you have recently expressed dissatisfaction with any part of your experience, think about how your disease might have been not a coincidence. Your symptoms could be the consequence of a deliberate choice to use chemical warfare under the pretense of food service to eradicate you as a problem. I'm Detective Samuel Pierce, and I've spent the last 15 years looking into maritime crimes. Years spent in the investigative service of the U.S. Coast Guard. However, when our cruiser arrived at a port that was not on a map, but when I noticed that none of the other travelers appeared to, I realized I wasn't looking into a crime until I realized we were somewhere we shouldn't have been. I was seeing a large-scale one being planned. I had reserved the Celebrity Reflection Cruise as part of my wife Sarah's and mine intended leisurely getaway after closing a particularly challenging case involving human trafficking that had taken up 2 years of my life. The matter concerned a network that transported victims over international borders using reputable companies, as well as my marriage and mental health had suffered greatly as a result of the probe. Sarah believed that taking a Caribbean cruise would allow me to unwind and reestablish a connection with the world outside of law enforcement. A stunning vessel, the Celebrity Reflection carried more than 3,000 people on a 10-day plan for the Southern Caribbean that included visits to Barbados, St. Lucia, Antigua, and a number of other well-known travel locations. As an off-duty detective, I ought to have been free to unwind and take advantage of the opulent facilities without scrutinizing each exchange or searching for indications of illegal activities. However, after 15 years of research, the worst I've learned to see patterns that others overlook because of the crimes people commit against one another. If that GPS, our actual destination, had not been revealed by malfunction, had I not been in the area designated for navigation when the ship's course was changed by hand, had the captain not erred in declaring that we had arrived at a port that did not exist, none of us passengers would have survived what they had in store for us at that unmarked location if there had been any official charts. Island. On our 7th day at sea, the first indication that something was amiss appeared. When I saw that Paradise Cove, a place I had previously visited, was listed as our next destination in the ship's daily newsletter. Never heard of, even though my prior research has given me a thorough understanding of Caribbean geography. The guest services desk gave me ambiguous information when I inquired about Paradise Cove, descriptions of experiences on private islands that would provide unique activities not found at commercial ports. I learned from my law enforcement training to be wary of any activity that prioritized confidentiality or exclusivity, particularly when it came to transporting vast numbers of people to remote areas. I started listening more intently to announcements and crew members' chats, and I saw that they were exceptionally anxious when talking about our impending take-a-break at Paradise Cove. On our 9th day, in the afternoon, I was, as I passed the AVU, ship's navigation center, I heard Captain Williams discussing something intense, and someone using the ship's satellite communication system, who I took to be a corporate representative. The discussion focused on cargo manifests and delivery timetables that did appear to have nothing to do with standard cruise operations. What was more concerning was the captain's repeated guarantees that quality control had been upheld and that the goods will arrive as promised during the journey. I observed odd behavior among the staff that night, which indicated getting ready for something more complicated than a normal port call. Safety. Although staff were claiming that the cabin-by-cabin checks were standard safety assessments, they appeared to be recording details regarding the physical state, traveling partners, and passenger demographics, instead of looking for potential safety risks. Additionally, I noticed that some crew members were dispersing what seemed to be passenger manifests with handwritten notes classifying individuals according to their physical characteristics, gender, and age fitness, and if they had family members accompanying them. The classifications seems to be intended to evaluate travelers, as the notations were estimations of market worth and processing complexity, and the commodities were not clients. The ship's intercom declared our arrival in Paradise Cove on the 9th morning, characterizing it as a private tropical paradise that is exclusively accessible to passengers on celebrity cruise lines. However, when I peered out from as far as I could tell, our balcony was not a well-developed tourist attraction. The island of Paradise Cove was densely wooded, with buildings that resembled warehouses rather than resort amenities, and temporary dock facilities. What was more unsettling was the reality that a number of other ships, including ones that were obviously not cruise vessels. I observed these ships loading and unloading cargo containers, and there was a level it seemed overkill for a tourist site to have so much security surrounding the dock area. There were armed guards in sight around the building, and there were radar devices and communications towers that indicated military or government activities. As travelers started getting off for what was billed as a beach outing, I observed that we were being categorized using the identical criteria that had been recorded during the inspections of the cabin. Solo travelers were kept apart from families with children. Older travelers were separated from younger adults, and passengers who looked to be in particular in good physical shape. Our dockside tour guides weren't your average ship excursion employees. They were males with a lot of muscle, military-style hairstyles, and communications gear, and it appeared that they were more concerned with managing passenger flow than with informing tourists. They sent us in the direction of what they said were leisure amenities, away from the dock area, but the path headed into a thick jungle with no signs of infrastructure. As we ventured farther into the center of the island, I started to observe infrastructure that was wholly out of keeping with the tourist attraction. There were holding areas that resembled prison barracks, medical stations that could handle big numbers of individuals, as well as administrative structures where untrained staff were entering data into computer systems and examining documentation. The majority of our group was led to a sizable clearing where hundreds of other cruise guests were, which was an unnerving discovery. Being arranged in lines for processing, as the guards termed it. The procedure included reviewing documentation, conducting medical exams, and allocating to various holding areas in accordance with I had seen the similar categorization system on the cruise. It became evident that there was absolutely no tourism at Paradise Cove. Cruise passengers used it as a hub for human trafficking, were being transported as goods to criminal groups that engaged in the harvesting of organs, forced labor, and more types of exploitation. The whole experience of the crew had been planned to take victims to this location while preserving the appearance of a valid holiday until it's too late to get out. The passengers were arranged according to their possible worth in various illicit markets. Young, fit adults were chosen for activities involving slave labor in isolated areas where they may labor for years without being caught. Kids were designated for international adoption fraud and exploitation networks. They were preparing elderly passengers with desirable organs for medical operations that would harvest their bodies. Components for affluent customers who could afford to buy illegally obtained transplant organs. The level of sophistication of the operation was astounding. According to reports, the cruise line was a genuine company that also acted as a front for human trafficking, where individuals are transported on the pretense of vacation processing plants from which they might be shipped to criminal organizations worldwide. The travelers had paid for their own kidnapping, and since international waters were closed off, nobody would search for them until it was too late to find out where they went. When I became aware of what was going on, I recognized that trying to individual escape would be futile. The island was encircled by water, fiercely secured, and built to keep anyone from departing without permission. However, I had learnt from my law enforcement training that illegal activities there are always weaknesses in this scale. Therefore, I started exploring for methods to interfere the processing mechanism and make mass escape possible. The turning point was when I realized that the trafficking operations coordination communication systems were susceptible to interference from the equipment for emergency broadcasting on board the ship. While passenger processing was hectic, I was able to reach the ship's radio room and sent out a distress call with our precise location and comprehensive details regarding the trafficking of human beings. The United States got the distress signal. Within hours, a concerted rescue effort was launched by Coast Guard stations and naval boats operating in the Caribbean. In progress. The traffickers made an effort to quicken their processing timetable and transfer people to transport ships prior to the arrival of rescue personnel. However, the logistical difficulty of managing rapid evacuation was impossible because of the thousands of people. The subsequent rescue effort was one of the biggest police operations in Caribbean history, with several nations and agencies cooperating collectively to dismantle a trafficking organization that has been in operation for more than 5 years. More than 2,000 travelers were members of criminal organizations were arrested as a result of the inquiry after being rescued from Paradise Cove in 12 different nations. However, the most significant result was revealing how respectable companies may be exploited as fronts for large-scale criminal activities and how international waterways are isolated gives criminals the chance to do crimes that aren't possible on land. The cruise. The industry is a perfect cover for trafficking operations because of its low level of oversight and self-regulation. Move victims across international borders covertly. The reflection of celebrities was discovered to be one of the cruise ships involved in human trafficking, transporting passengers to processing plants posing as vacation spots on private islands. The travelers who had vanished on prior voyages had not unintentionally perished or fallen overboard. They been sold into various types of contemporary slavery and given to criminal networks. Additionally, the inquiry showed that while some crew members participated in the trafficking scheme, others were compelled to, under threat of violence on their families, they take part. The intricate global character of cruise ships' operations make it simple for criminal groups to enter lawful enterprises and put them to unlawful use. Paradise Cove has been open today, closed, and its infrastructure demolished, yet additional trafficking activities continuing to transport victims on private islands and cruise ships. The cruise. Although the business has put new security measures in place, the underlying flaws that allowed these crimes to occur might still be in existence. When scheduling a voyage in the future, keep in mind that the ship you can be traveling to places that aren't shown on any maps when you board, and that your trip can turn into a nightmare from which you never awaken.